Everybody knows what the EU is. It's this union between 27 European countries to have a stronger, more united Europe. And it has worked. The EU is the second largest global economy, just behind the United States. People can travel and live freely inside of the EU. For many people, especially older people, it's this organization that gave us freedom and peace. It's for these reasons that the EU has a high approval rating amongst its member states. But how does the EU even work? What is the difference between the European Parliament and the European Commission? What power does the EU have over its member states? And how can you track the activities of the EU yourself? Chapter 1. The 7 main institutions. The EU works like a federalist state with a lot of extra steps. There is a legislative branch elected by the people, which then elects or appoints the executive branch. And then there is the judicative branch, which isn't elected by the legislative or executive, but by the member state governments. But then why are there 7 institutions instead of 3? Let's go through every single one. I'll start with the ones that are the least important for the average person to understand to be involved with the politics of the European Union. The Court of Justice, CJEU. The Court of Justice, or CJEU, works just like any other court. It interprets the law of the European Union, ensures that the law is observed, reviews actions taken by EU countries or companies in the EU countries and enforces compliance. It is very independent from EU institutions, as judges and advocates general are unanimously appointed by the national governments of member states. The Court of Auditors, ECA. The European Court of Auditors, or ECA, is not an official court with judicial power, but more like the budget manager of the European Union. Its main job is to audit the spendings and the budget of the European Union. To avoid bias and fraud, it is as independent as possible from the other European institutions. If it finds something wrong, it reports it to the executive body, the European Commission, which then takes action. An example would be when in the early 2000s, several regions in England mismanaged their EU funds. The ECA found a problem, reported it to the European Commission, which then took action by freezing the funds until the issue was solved. The European Central Bank, ECB. The European Central Bank, or ECB, is the institution that manages the Eurozone. It is the central component of the Euro system and the European System of Central Banks, ESCB, which is the European Central Bank institution that also includes the national banks of every member state. There are 4 main bodies of the ECB: the Executive Board, the Governing Council, the General Council, and the Supervisory Board. The Governing Council is the boss. It comprises the members of the Executive Board and the governors of the national banks only of the Eurozone countries. It decides on monetary policy, for example the target inflation for this year, or whether to approve the printing of money by a certain country. The Executive Board is responsible for the day-to-day running of the bank and the execution of the monetary policy. It can issue decisions to national central banks and may also exercise powers delegated to it by the Governing Council. The General Council is special, as it is the only body that can be dissolved in the future. This is because its sole purpose is the responsibility of the transition to the euro by EU member states. Once all EU members adopted the euro, the General Council won't have a purpose anymore. The Supervisory Board is to the ECB what the Court of Auditors is to the EU. It is as independent as possible from the ECB. It is made up of the chair and vice chair, which are appointed by the EU, 4 ECB representatives, and representatives of each EU national bank. As the name says, it supervises the decisions of the ECB, but also proposes draft decisions to the Governing Council. These 3 institutions don't have a lot of political power, but are important to keep the EU running smoothly and orderly. Without them, there would be no euro and no law and order. The next 4 institutions are the most important in terms of political power. They make laws, vote on them, are responsible for foreign policy, represent the European people, appoint important positions, and so much more. Let's start with the European Council. The European Council is made up of the heads of state or government of the members of the European Union, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the President of the European Council, Antonio Costa. It acts as a collective presidency of the EU, with a great indirect executive power as the members are the executive in their respective country. The Council meets twice every 6 months, in so-called European summits. It leads the political direction of the EU as they appoint or propose the presidents for other institutions like the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and more. The European Commission. The European Commission is the institution with the most executive power. It consists of 27 commissioners, including the President Ursula von der Leyen and 32,000 civil servants. It is the only institution that is supposed to represent European rather than national interests. The European Commission has a lot of responsibilities, but the most relevant is that it is the only institution allowed to propose laws for the European Union. The Parliament, the Council of the EU, and the people, if there is a petition over 1 million signatures, can request the Commission to propose a law, but it can always refuse. The Commission also isn't influential in all aspects of politics. It leads in economic and climate policy with countless trade agreements and regulations, but it isn't as relevant as the European Council and the Council of the European Union in foreign policy, as there aren't any heads of states in the European Commission. The Council of the European Union and the European Parliament decide on the members of the European Commission. A recent example are the proposals by the opposition in the European Parliament to remove Ursula von der Leyen and her current Commission from power. The Council of the EU or the Council of Ministers. The Council of the EU or the Council of Ministers may sound the same and have the same logo as the European Council, but it is something way different. It is one of two institutions that has legislative powers, meaning it can approve, amend and reject laws. It is an intergovernmental institution, meaning that members are allowed and should represent their state's interest. The special thing about the Council of Ministers is that there aren't fixed council seats. Yes, there are 27 seats for each country, but they vary regarding the issue that is being discussed. If there is a discussion or a vote on agricultural issues, such as the regulation of pesticides, then the agricultural ministers of each member country are occupying the seats of the Council, with the President of the Council being a country that changes every 6 months. The only exception is when foreign policy is discussed. Then the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, takes the role of presidency. If a law or decision is to pass, then the Council must have the same decision as the European Parliament. The European Parliament. While the Council of the EU is like the US Senate, where each member state has the same amount of representatives, the European Parliament works like the US House of Representatives, where each member state has a certain amount of seats based on their population size. The European Parliament is the second EU institution alongside the Council of the EU that has legislative powers. There are 720 members of Parliament and one president, Roberta Metsola. These 720 members aren't divided by country but by political alignment. There are 9 political groups, of which 4 are in Commission, 4 in opposition, and 1 showing mixed support from the outside. The President of the European Parliament, or the Speaker, Roberta Metsola, represents the European Parliament internationally, manages the activities of the European Parliament, such as debates, and her signature is required to pass a law. Chapter 2. Important personalities and the roles in the EU. This is a quick review of important personalities and the roles in the European Union, so that when headlines appear you know to which institution this person belongs and what their powers are. Any MEP. A MEP is a member of the European Parliament. Their job is to vote on laws and other EU matters in the European Parliament. An example would be Milan Mazurek of the ESN party from Slovakia. Ursula von der Leyen is the President of the European Commission. The reason why she is in the spotlight, especially by the opposition and Eurosceptic sources, is because she leads the institution that makes all the laws that certain people don't like. She likely won't be removed from her position though, as the majority of Parliament expresses support for her. She represents the EU internationally on economy and climate. Roberta Metsola is the President of the European Parliament. She doesn't have power as an individual, she's just a representative of the European Parliament. This also means that she can vote on laws and decisions. If the European Parliament makes a decision, she has to represent that decision whether she agrees or not. Where she has a lot of influence is running the European Parliament. She is responsible for leading debates and distributing speaking time amongst the different parties. Internationally, she represents the European Parliament in maintaining relations with other parliaments like the US Congress or the UK Parliament. Antonio Costa is the President of the European Council. His role is similar to Roberta Metzola's role in the European Parliament. He prepares the work of the European Council, organizes and chairs its meetings, and reports to the European Parliament. However, he isn't allowed to vote on issues either. He represents the EU at international summits or at meetings with heads of state. Kaja Kallas is the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security and the Vice President of the European Commission. Her job is pretty much already set by the long title. As High Representative, she represents the EU on an international level for foreign and security policy and issues regarding these areas. Chapter 3. How EU laws are passed. Step 1. A law is drafted by the European Commission, either by the Commission itself or as a request by the European Parliament, the Council of the EU, or the European people. Step 2. The draft is sent to the European Parliament for a first reading. It is read and discussed by the 20 committees of the European Parliament. They make changes and recommendations. After that, the Parliament votes to either accept or reject the legislation. If rejected, it is sent back to the European Commission for negotiations. If accepted, it is sent to the Council of the EU. Step 3. The Council of the EU reviews the legislation and usually makes amendments before voting. If rejected, it is sent back to the European Commission for negotiations. If accepted, it goes back to the European Parliament for a second reading. Step 4. The Parliament can accept, reject, or propose amendments to the legislation. Step 5. If differences between the Council and the European Parliament persist, a conciliation committee is formed to find a compromise. Step 6. Once a compromise is found, or if the law was accepted beforehand, it is adopted and the European Commission is responsible for executing the law. All member states must include the law into their national law. Chapter 4. How you can track the EU's activity. It is important to read more than just the news headlines or what party or the EU says on their social media. I'll show you 4 websites where you can track different stages of EU lawmaking. Website number 1. oeil.secure.europarl.europa.eu. This is where you can follow the current process of a law and find the official names for laws. You can see which laws were discussed by the European Parliament and what it's exactly about. Website number 2. eur-lex.europa.eu. This is where you can search for laws and look at exactly what they say. Here's a quick example where I search for the law COM 2025-180 Final 2025-0097 COD regarding new roadworthiness standards for motor vehicles. You'll find a summary about everything regarding this law, which committee is responsible when it was discussed in the European Parliament, the outcome and the law itself. If you want to read the whole proposal, type the law number into your browser and click on the European Parliament website where you'll find the whole detailed law. Website number 3. ec.europa.eu/info/law/better-regulation/have-your-say. This is where you can search for proposals and drafts by the European Commission which weren't discussed yet by the Parliament. You can even give feedback to the European Commission. Website number 4. europarl.europa.eu/plenary/en/votes.html. This is the official website of the European Parliament, and here you can compare the votes of individual MEPs during plenary sessions. For that, you'll need to search for roll call vote. However, sometimes laws are voted on the old-fashioned way by a show of hands. In that case, you would only see if the law was adopted or not. Number 5. europarl.europa.eu/committees/en/home.html. This section of the website is for individual committees that I talked about in step 2 of EU lawmaking, and it works on the same principle as the plenary voting. You'll need to select a committee, go to meetings, and then votes. This is interesting to track how your MEPs decide in their respective committee. I hope that you now better understand how the European Union works. This by far isn't everything about the European Union. In the future, I will be doing videos on the history of the EU, a deep dive on the individual institutions, how countries can join the EU, how the Eurozone works, and how different EU officials are elected or appointed. We can't talk about the European Union without understanding it first. For this video, I mainly used Wikipedia as a source. I'll leave a link in the description alongside the websites to track the European Union. Check out my Instagram, Twitter, and Rumble. I'm Slovak Roiver, and see you next week.